Hello, this is Wes Bridel, and this is another Kingdom Calling Economic Update video. It's been almost a month since we did the last one, so I'm going to fire off a bunch of them here tonight, and they'll be put up over the next week where you're watching this. And we're going to jump in with two videos on hyperinflation, deflation, what do all these inflations mean, what's going on in the world. There's some crazy stuff going on out there in the last month. And currency wars, what does that mean to you? Really, there's some heavy stuff. All of these videos are update videos to the coming storm video that we put together last November. You can watch that for free at the link near this video, and if you haven't seen that, I highly recommend you do that, because that is the overall big picture, whereas this is just what's been going on in the last month. If you watch that video, you will notice that many of the things that I talked about have already come to pass over the last year. But some of the biggest things haven't happened yet, and we'll be talking a little bit about that in this video. And those are things that you better be prepared for, because they're coming and they're going to affect you. So let me jump right into that. I'm going to start with this video. As I start putting the things together, it was too long for one video, so this is going to be the US version, things that are kind of focused on going on in this country, and then we're going to talk about things going on in the rest of the world that very much do affect us in the next video. First thing is your investments have probably been in a rally for the last month and a half. Here's another way to look at it. September and the beginning of October saw the US dollar crash. So if you saw your stocks shoot up, commodities shoot up, basically those things are, a lot of them are flat if you take the dollar out of it. Basically they've gone up as much as the dollar has gone down. So that's why we've seen a huge run up in a lot of our investments. The Fed recently admitted to having a strategy to continually lower borrowing costs to inflate asset prices higher than they would otherwise be. So this is bizarre. That has never been part of the Fed's job, and all of a sudden they're now admitting that, well, we can help people by where you're giving all this money to the banks, and that will help people because that will make the economy or the stock market, the different markets, be higher in value, and so people will benefit that way. That's a Ponzi scheme that they can keep throwing more money at it. That obviously has to end at some time, and then the obvious consequences would be it comes crashing down. That's what happens with a Ponzi scheme. It works at first because more and more people put money in it, and that money filters to the people at the top. But the more time goes on, the more masses of people that you have to find to put money into, and you can't find them, and the whole thing blows up. That's what Madoff was doing here a few months back. That's exactly what the Fed is admitting they're doing. They're just printing money, hoping that that will make the stock market go up. Well, the stock market eventually will come back to basics, and we'll have one video on the market. But that's a scary thing that the Fed is admitting to that. The other thing that they said is that inflation has fallen to unacceptable levels. Again, they have a dual mandate, jobs and price stability. Well, of course, they don't really have the ability to do that, but that's what their mandate is. Price stability is not inflation. And yet here a Fed governor said that we don't have enough inflation. It may have been Bernanke, I don't remember who said it. That's a scary thing, that the Fed is now purposely trying to bring about inflation. But that's another thing they recently said. So some scary things coming out of the Fed recently. And if you hold dollars, if you think about it, and this is what we've seen, the dollar's been crashing the last month and a half. If you're in another country and you hold dollars, and the Federal Reserve, who has the power to print money, starts going around saying we need more inflation, which is another word for the value of the dollar dropping. If you hold dollars, how does that make you feel? Not good, and so that's what we've seen happening. When we get into the international stuff, there's some really scary stuff going on, and you might think international doesn't affect you, but it very much does, because we're dependent on these trillions of dollars being wanted in the rest of the world. If they don't want them anymore, we're all going to feel it. In the last year, gold is up 40%, silver's up 43%, base metals up 30%. In the last few months alone, food has shot up 25%. This is inflation or dollar debasement. It's kind of the same thing in this circumstance. The dollar is just dropping in value by those amounts. So if you've been working with us, you've been following us, doing these things, you're doing really well, but this is a scary thing for what's going on out there and how it's going to affect us moving forward. Bernanke recently in Rhode Island said exactly what we've been saying for the last year. This is unbelievable to me because Ben Bernanke, everything he says is going to be quoted. People are going to hear it and they're going to take it apart and look at it just like I've been doing. And he actually laid out in some small little meeting in Rhode Island saying that we're heading down a road to disaster. Of course, he put it a little nicer and a little subtler than I do, but it's a scary thing. And he said, what was the few words? That our situation is dire and unsustainable. Now, he made it act like, oh, we can kind of, hopefully things will go well and we'll get out of it. I'm telling you, we're not going to get out of this situation. It's impossible. But that's very close to what he said, dire and unsustainable. I would recommend you go out and look at that. If you're on the newsletter, I'm going to put that out in the newsletter I have about to come out, a link to those comments. But unbelievable, the Fed chairman has just been repeating what we've been saying here at Kingdom Calling. Let's see, Bill Gross says the Fed will pump $100 billion into the system each month for quantitative easing 2, a 30% increase in our money supply in the first year. That's massive inflation. That's actually the definition of inflation. So there's a lot of people that run around and say there's no inflation, there's no inflation. That actually is the definition of inflation. So there's no question we've had inflation. What some people are wondering about, will we see prices rise as a result of inflation? And I would say we're definitely going to see that sooner or later. I would say we'll see that here in the next year. We're certainly seeing it in a lot of areas, but we have, of course, real estate. There's a crisis going on there, so we're not seeing it there. A lot of people are getting tighter, their margins are getting squeezed. We haven't seen it in a lot of consumer prices yet, but in base prices it's there, and it's going to be affecting us because even if the price of things across the board continue to drop, what is the Fed's response to that? Print more money, print more money. Do you think they're not going to win? They have a printing press. They will win. It's going to be ugly for us when they win, but that's what's going to happen. It's a scary thing. I think I've got this on one of my other notes, but Bill Gross and a couple others have basically shown that they're getting tipped off by the Fed before the Fed makes their announcement public. They're getting tipped off what the Fed is about to do. That's a scary thing. That's not right. That's not the way our country is supposed to work. They have investment tips, insider tips from the government, from the Fed, before the rest of us. That's not a good thing. Anyways, Bill Gross is saying that he thinks the Fed is going to put in $100 billion a month, which is just a huge increase to money supply. And so we'll see what's going to happen. Basically, I'll get into this in the stock market, but the Fed has got the whole market believing they're going to pump in massive amounts of money. If they don't, that could be a disaster. If they do, that's a disaster. It's kind of like all the economic situations that we have right now. Just looking at the U.S. Treasuries, there's only 550 billion of Treasuries out of the 14 trillion outstanding Treasuries that are dated longer than 10 years. So it's a scary thing, this $14 trillion that we owe. It's all coming due very, very soon. Much of it in like a year, 2 years, 3 years time. The QE, the quantitative easing, the real reason, of course, that they're doing this, they have to pay for debt. So there's no way that the U.S. government can possibly pay off its debt. If they print enough money, then they can do that. And actually, the Fed is now the second biggest holders of treasuries. We just passed Japan. So we are now loaning ourselves with newly, freshly printed dollars more money than any country other than China, and we'll pass them soon, I'm sure. And let's see, just as far as the quantitative easing, every country would run out of money very, very quickly, except they're all doing this. And so we'll get into that in the international section. The U.S. has $5.3 trillion in debt maturing in the next 3 years. What happens when interest rates rise? They're eventually, as we'll talk about, the world is going to demand higher interest rates in order to lend us money. And unless the world's just going to let us get away with printing enough money to buy all of our debt. You know, if they're going to let us do that, I guess we should. But they're not going to let us do that. The more we own, they're already getting very, very scared. And so if 5.3 trillion is maturing within 3 years, that is a massive amount of money. That is what, 8% of the entire world's GDP we have to borrow within the next 3 years. If the people around the world decide, you know what, I don't know that I want to keep my money in US Treasuries at these nothing rates when the value of the dollar is dropping, if I'm going to lend it to you, I demand a lot higher interest rates. That hits the budget directly, and all of a sudden we have a much bigger deficit, which means more debt. You can see the problem starts coming back on itself and circulating, becoming bigger and bigger. The U.S. House passed a tariff bill right before recess against China to allow up to 25% tariffs on China. The Senate will vote when they return, and that was an overwhelming vote for that. So it seems to be very popular. This is a pretty scary thing. Very similar things happened in the 1930s for the Great Depression. Each country is starting to turn nationalistic, turn against each other, and that usually just puts a complete slam on economic growth. Let's see, Illinois, just to kind of get you ready for the next video, Illinois now pays more interest to borrow money than Mexico. Mexico has recently defaulted, I think in the 80s. Illinois, Chicago, home of President Barack Obama, has to pay more in interest to borrow money than Mexico does. That should startle you, but that's a fact of the world right now. Illinois is in bad shape. California is in bad shape. Pretty much most of our states are in bad shape. There's going to be a lot more bailouts coming. Hopefully this is a good primer. The next video we're going to get into what's going on internationally, which is really scarier because in the U.S. we're getting along by having foreigners lend us money. As long as they continue to lend us money, we can keep doing it. A lot of people like to compare us to Japan and say, well, Japan has 200% debt, so they have more debt than we have. But what is not noticed there is Japan has been funding their debt by their own people. Their own people over the last couple of decades have been great savers, and so they export more than they import, so they can use that money to buy their own debt, to try their quantitative easing, which hasn't worked for 2 decades. We, on the other hand, are not savers, and we desperately need foreigners to lend us money in order for us to continue borrowing, importing more than we export, continue these crazy quantitative easing scenarios that have never worked. And so we desperately need that. If the foreigners decide not to lend us money anymore, we're in deep, deep trouble, and that's what our next video is going to be about. Hope you'll join us. Again, if you haven't seen The Coming Storm, it is a live presentation we did in November 2009, and it covers really what is happening in the economy and what's about to happen. Again, if you watch that, you'll see, wow, he said a lot of these things, and they've happened in the last year, and maybe that will give you confidence and make you really pay attention about the big things that we talked about that haven't yet happened. You still do have time to prepare. Thanks for watching this. God bless you.